Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be looking into a really chilling criminal case, the Marc Dutroux case. It's a story that really just shocked Belgium and continues to have a huge impact on the nation. And we're going to be exploring a whole bunch of different sources, court documents, psychological profiles, investigative reports, and even firsthand accounts, really to understand not only the horrific crimes themselves, but also like what allowed them to even happen in the first place.
Yeah, it's a story that really raises a lot of difficult questions about human nature and the justice system and just the very fabric of society.
Yeah, exactly. Imagine this. It's the 1990s, and all of Belgium is just gripped by fear as a series of child abductions just starts unfolding. And Marc Dutroux, who seems like a totally ordinary electrician, becomes like the prime suspect. And what's so crazy is that Dutroux was already known to the police, but somehow he just totally managed to slip through the cracks. Our sources detail a history of petty crimes and then escalating to sexual assault, and then get this a really short prison sentence, which some people say actually set the stage for his later atrocities.
Yeah, that's right. And even the investigation itself was full of missteps and missed opportunities. It's almost unbelievable how many red flags were ignored, how many times authorities could have maybe intervened but didn't.
This is where our deep dive gets really interesting. We're not just looking at the crimes themselves, but also trying to unpack like the societal and systemic failures that allowed them to happen in the first place, kind of like peeling back layers of an onion. Each source we look at just reveals another layer of complexity.
And it's not even just about assigning blame. It's about really understanding the factors that led to Dutroux's descent into darkness, the psychological underpinnings of his crimes, and how someone seemingly ordinary could commit such horrific acts.
So let's start with Dutroux's childhood.
Yeah.
All of our sources really paint this picture of like a really troubled upbringing. There was parental neglect and constant moving and a lack of any kind of stability. Do you think that kind of unstable environment could have had a role in shaping like his psyche?
It's definitely something to think about. Childhood experiences, especially traumatic ones, can have a really huge impact on someone's development. In Dutroux's case, not having a stable or loving home environment could have caused feelings of rejection and insecurity and a desperate need for control.
That makes sense. And our sources also talk about a pivotal moment in his youth, the discovery of his father's erotic magazines. Some experts think that this, along with the emotional void in his life, could have contributed to like a distorted view of sexuality and relationships.
For sure. If you combine early exposure to sexually explicit stuff with a lack of healthy emotional connections, it can create a really dangerous cocktail. It can lead to a skewed understanding of intimacy and a blurring of boundaries, and in some cases, even a tendency toward deviant behavior.
That's a really interesting point. So we're already starting to see some potential contributing factors here. A troubled childhood, possible early exposure to inappropriate stuff, and a growing need for control.
And as we get deeper into Dutroux's life, we see this pattern of control and manipulation emerging in his relationships and his criminal activities. His early crimes, particularly those involving theft and deception, reveal a cunning and calculated mind and a willingness to exploit others for personal gain.
And then his first marriage. The sources describe it as like tumultuous and marked by Dutroux's controlling behavior. It eventually ended in divorce, but not before kind of foreshadowing the darker stuff that would come out later.
What's so fascinating and scary is that this pattern seems to happen again in his second marriage to Michelle Martin, and that relationship would become a pivotal and deeply tragic aspect of this whole case.
This is where the story gets really chilling. As we dig into the details of Dutroux's crimes, it becomes clear that we're dealing with a level of premeditation and cruelty that's almost impossible to understand. And Michelle Martin's role in all of this is something we'll need to look at closely.
Absolutely. Her involvement raises all sorts of questions about complicity and manipulation and the complex dynamics that can happen in abusive relationships.
So get ready, because we're about to enter the darkest chapter of this story. We're going to be looking at how he built the dungeon, the abductions, and the horrible fate that awaited Dutroux's victims.
It's like going into the depths of human depravity. But it's important to remember that even in the face of such darkness, there are stories of resilience and courage that come up. And those are the stories that we also need to tell.
I totally agree. It's super important to honor the memory of the victims and to acknowledge their suffering and to learn from the mistakes that allowed this whole thing to happen. So, with that in mind, let's move on to the events that would change Belgium and the world forever. The abductions that began Dutroux's reign of terror.
This period, from the early 1980s to the mid-1990s, shows a chilling increase in Dutroux's criminal behavior. It's like a descent into darkness, fueled by a growing sense that he could get away with anything and a complete disregard for human life.
And this is where the failures of the justice system become so obvious. The fact that he was able to commit serious crimes, even spend time in prison, and then get released to just continue his reign of terror is mind-blowing.
It really highlights the need for systemic change, for a justice system that's better at identifying and managing high-risk individuals, and for more accountability when those systems fail.
It's also a reminder that we all have a responsibility to be vigilant, to speak out against injustice, and to work towards creating a world where children are safe from predators like Marc Dutroux.
Absolutely. By understanding what led to this tragedy, both individually and as a society, we can start to address the root causes of such horrific crimes and try to prevent them from happening again.
This case is like a dark stain on Belgian history, and it's a story that keeps going even today. The investigations, the trials, the search for answers, it's a testament to the huge impact of these crimes and the ongoing quest for justice.
And as we dig deeper, we'll be exploring the complex web of events and the shocking details of the crimes and the lasting legacy of Marc Dutroux, the man who became known as the Monster of Belgium. But we'll also be looking at the stories of resilience, the fight for justice, and the lessons learned from this horrific chapter in human history.
So let's start with the early abductions. The first victims, abducted and abused in the 1980s, give us crucial insights into Dutroux's methods and the disturbing patterns that would define his crimes. We'll examine the details of these early cases, the role of his accomplices, and the incredibly light sentences that let him continue to prey on innocent people.
These early cases are super important to understanding the escalation of violence, the increasing boldness of his actions, and the shocking lack of accountability that allowed him to operate with impunity for so long. It's like watching a train wreck in slow motion, knowing that each derailment brings us closer to the final tragedy.
It's a scary thought, and it sets the stage for the truly horrific events that would happen in the 1990s. Events that would change Belgium and the world forever.
Those later abductions, where young girls just vanished without a trace, had the whole nation gripped with fear. The disappearance of Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo in 1995, just two 8-year-old girls who disappeared while walking home, caused nationwide panic and put huge pressure on the authorities to find the guy responsible.
And yet, even with all that attention on him, Dutroux was still able to operate, abducting Anne Marchal and Ifche Lambrex later that same year. It's crazy how bold his crimes were, his ability to avoid being caught, despite all the attention and the huge manhunt going on.
It shows how cunning he was, how carefully he planned everything, and how he could manipulate and control the people around him. He was a master manipulator, like a chameleon who could blend into any environment and seem totally normal while hiding the darkest secrets.
It's almost unbelievable that he was able to build a secret dungeon under his house. A soundproof room made specifically to keep his victims captive. It says a lot about how much he planned this, how cold-hearted he was, and how deep his depravity went.
The dungeon is like a scary symbol of Dutroux's reign of terror. It's a physical representation of his twisted desires and his need for complete control. It's a place where innocence was destroyed, where hope died, and where evil ruled.
And it's in this horrifying place that Julie and Melissa met their tragic fate. Starved, abused, and ultimately left to die while Dutroux was serving a short sentence for stealing a car. Their story is just heartbreaking, a testament to the evil that can hide under the surface of everyday life.
Their deaths, while Dutroux was technically in custody, mark a really important turning point in the case. This is where the public outrage over the investigation got really intense, where it became clear that the authorities messed up, and where the seeds of distrust were planted.
It's also the point where the story starts to feel almost surreal. This mix of horror, disbelief, and anger that would forever mark Belgium.
And from this point on, the case spirals into this complex web of conspiracy theories, accusations of cover-ups, and a desperate search for answers that would go on for decades.
The Dutroux case isn't just a story about a monster. It's a story about a society struggling to deal with something unthinkable, a justice system trying to cope with its own failures, and a nation forever scarred by the depths of human depravity.
And it's a story that has lessons for everyone, lessons about how important it is to be vigilant, the need for accountability, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find justice and healing in the face of something so terrible.
It's hard to believe that even while the whole country was mourning Julie and Melissa, Dutroux was still out there. In 1996, he took two more young girls, Sabine Dardenne and Laetitia Delhaize. As we look into these later abductions, something that really gets me is the contrast between how brutal his crimes were and the normal everyday places where they happened. These girls were just taken from their bikes, from streets they knew, places that should felt safe.
It is pretty jarring. It makes you question your own sense of safety and reminds us that evil can be hiding anywhere. And what's really scary about Sabine and Letitia's abductions is that it seems like Dutroux is getting bolder, more confident that he wouldn't get caught. It's like the failures of those first investigations made him think he was untouchable.
That is a terrifying thought, and the details about how he kept them prisoner, as we see in the sources, are just awful. The dungeon, this custom-made chamber of horrors, becomes the center of their ordeal. Can you tell us a bit about what we know about what they went through? What kind of psychological impact does being held captive in such a dehumanizing place have?
Just imagine being stuck in a tiny, dark space, completely cut off from the outside world, at the mercy of a man who doesn't even see you as a person, just something he can control and abuse. The psychological trauma from that kind of environment is huge. Sabine and Letitia lived in constant fear. They were manipulated, and their sense of self was systematically destroyed.
Reading their accounts, I'm really struck by how resilient they were, how determined they were to survive. Sabine, especially, showed so much courage in the face of such cruelty. She stood up to Dutroux, challenged him, and even managed to hold on to some hope in all that darkness.
Her spirit is incredible. It shows you how strong the human will can be, the ability to find even a little bit of light in the darkest places. And Letitia, even though she was younger and maybe more vulnerable, she also showed amazing resilience. Both of these girls went through unbelievable horrors, but they never gave up hope of being rescued.
And thankfully, they were right to hope. When they found the dungeon and rescued Sabine and Letitia, the whole nation breathed a sigh of relief. It felt like a victory over evil, proof that the investigators never gave up, and that hope can triumph over despair. Can you take us through what happened that led to this breakthrough, what finally stopped Dutroux?
Oh, it was a few things, really. The police were under a lot of pressure, the public was outraged, and there was this growing feeling that the investigation had been botched from the beginning, so they refocused, got more determined to find those missing girls, and then they got lucky, a tip that led them right to Dutroux's house.
It wasn't just luck, though, was it? There was a police officer, a young inspector named René Michaud, who was really important in the rescue. He didn't follow the usual rules, challenged how things were done, and in the end, it was his persistence that paid off.
Michaud is a really interesting part of this story. He represents what's good about law enforcement, that commitment to justice, that refusal to give up, even when it seems impossible. What he did shows how important individual courage is, how important it is to challenge the status quo, and to never forget about the human cost of these crimes.
His story reminds us that even in a flawed system, there are people who are trying to do the right thing, who embody justice and compassion. But sadly, even as Sabine and Letitia were being reunited with their families, the full horror of what Dutroux had done was still coming out.
Finding the bodies of Julie and Melissa, along with the remains of two other girls, Anne Marchal and Yves Lambrex, just added to the nation's grief and made people even angrier at the authorities. The public wanted answers, they wanted someone to be held responsible, they wanted justice.
And that's when the focus shifted from the horror of the crimes to how the system failed and allowed them to happen. Parliamentary inquiry, all the media attention, the public protests, it all showed a nation feeling deeply betrayed.
The Dutroux case became like a national trauma. Belgium had to confront some ugly truths about itself, about being too complacent, about being negligent, about the blind spots that let a predator like Dutroux operate for so long.
The case also led to a ton of conspiracy theories. Rumors of a high-level pedophile ring, accusations of cover-ups, and people blocking the investigation. Even though most of that is unproven, all the speculation shows how much trust had been lost, the feeling that someone was hiding the truth.
Those conspiracy theories, whether they're true or not, feed into a really deep fear. A feeling that the people in power aren't always doing what's best for the people they're supposed to be serving. And when people lose trust like that, it has a really damaging effect on society. It makes us question our institutions and makes it harder to address the root causes of problems like child abuse.
It's a serious thought. It shows how long-lasting the impact of cases like this can be. The wounds go deep, the scars stay, and the questions linger even after the news stories fade away.
And in Marc Dutroux's case, those questions are really troubling. Because even though he was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, we still don't have the whole story. There are things that don't add up, inconsistencies in the evidence, and a feeling that some truths might never come out.
And that brings us to the trials, the legal battles, the fight for justice that went on for years after Dutroux was arrested. What can you tell us about the proceedings, the difficulties of prosecuting such a high-profile case, and what the final outcome was?
The trials were a huge spectacle, a media circus, a way for the public to let out their emotions. But they were also a complicated legal battle, a fight to sort through all the evidence, to figure out what was true and what wasn't, and to make sure the process was fair and impartial, even with all the pressure from the public and the media.
And don't forget, it wasn't just Dutroux on trial. His accomplices, including Michelle Martin, had to face the music too. They tried to justify their actions and downplay their involvement in all the horror.
Michelle Martin's case especially became a lightning rod for public anger. When she said she was a victim too, controlled by Dutroux, people didn't buy it. They were outraged. The idea that a mother could just stand by and watch as children were abused and killed was impossible for a lot of people to understand.
She was eventually convicted, but her sentence was pretty light, and that just added fuel to the debate about accountability, about whether the punishments for these horrific crimes were enough, and about the complex dynamics of abusive relationships. It brought up uncomfortable questions about how far compassion should go, how hard it is to tell who's guilty and who's a victim, and the need for a justice system that truly understands the seriousness of these crimes.
And the controversy around Martin didn't stop there. When she was released from prison after serving only a small part of her sentence, people protested, and the whole debate about punishment versus rehabilitation started up again. It felt like the system was prioritizing the rights of criminals over the needs of victims, and it made people even more distrustful of the legal system.
It reminds us that justice isn't always clear-cut. Even when faced with pure evil, there are gray areas that make it hard to understand guilt, responsibility, and even human nature itself.
The Dutroux case, with all its complicated characters, shocking discoveries, and its long-lasting legacy of pain and distrust, forces us to face these uncomfortable truths. It makes us question our ideas about good and evil, shows us the weaknesses in our systems, and reminds us that the fight for justice is never over. It's a constant struggle to make sure these kinds of horrors never happen again.
And that fight continues today. The investigations into whether Dutroux was involved in other disappearances, the search for other missing children, the efforts to uncover the whole truth about his crimes, all of this shows the lasting impact of this case and how much people want justice.
The Dutroux case shows us that even in the face of incredible darkness, the human spirit can endure. It's a story about the strength of the victims, the courage of those who speak out against injustice, and the constant pursuit of truth and accountability. And it's a story that makes us never forget, never give up, and never stop fighting for a world where children are safe, loved, and protected.
With that powerful message in mind, let's shift our focus to Dutroux's victims. Their stories, their strength, their fight for justice, they all deserve to be heard and remembered. We'll explore how Dutroux's crimes impacted their lives, the long journey of healing, and the ongoing work to honor their memory and make sure their voices are never silenced.
The victims of Marc Dutroux went through unimaginable suffering, but their stories are also testaments to the strength of the human spirit. Their courage, their resilience, and their determination to rebuild their lives are powerful reminders that even after the most horrific experiences, healing and hope are still possible.
Let's start with Sabine Dordain and Laetitia Delhaize. They're the two girls who miraculously survived being held in Dutroux's dungeon. Their stories of being held captive, of being rescued, and of the long road to recovery are both heartbreaking and inspiring.
Sabine and Laetitia were kept prisoner for months. They were subjected to horrific abuse, robbed of their freedom, their dignity, and their childhoods. But they came out of that darkness with remarkable strength and resilience.
When they testified during Dutroux's trial, it was incredibly powerful. They gave a voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves and showed the world just how depraved he was. They spoke with such clarity and conviction that they captured the nation's attention and reminded everyone of the real human cost of these crimes.
For them to confront their abuser, to relive their trauma in such a public way, was incredibly brave. It showed how determined they were to get justice, to hold Dutroux accountable, and to make sure their voices were heard.
And their courage didn't stop there. Both Sabine and Laetitia have become advocates for victims' rights. They share their stories and use their experiences to raise awareness about child sexual abuse and the need to better protect and support survivors.
They've taken their pain and turned it into something positive, transforming their trauma into a force for good. Their advocacy work is a strong reminder that even after the most horrible experiences, healing and hope are possible.
And their stories really show us how strong the human spirit can be, the ability to find meaning and purpose even after going through something so terrible.
But tragically, not all of Dutroux's victims survived. Julie Lejeune and Melissa Rousseau, the two 8-year-old girls found dead in Dutroux's garden, became symbols of lost innocence, the terrible consequences of his crimes, and the profound grief that gripped the entire nation.
Their deaths led to a huge wave of national mourning. The whole country was overcome with grief and anger, and it really shook Belgium to its core. The image of their smiling faces, frozen in time, became this haunting reminder of how fragile life is and the devastating impact of Dutroux's evil.
Their families, their loved ones, were left to cope with the unbearable pain of losing a child in such a horrific way. And knowing that their daughter's deaths could have been prevented, that the system failed to protect them, made their grief even worse.
The stories of Julie and Melissa, along with the stories of Anne Marshall and Yveshe Lambrechts, the two teenagers who were also murdered by Dutroux, constantly remind us of the human cost of these crimes. Their lives, their potential, their dreams, all taken away by a man driven by darkness and enabled by a system full of flaws.
Their deaths and all the suffering they went through should never be forgotten. They are a powerful call to action. They remind us that we all have to be vigilant, that we can never be complacent, and that we must always strive to create a world where children are safe from harm.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's important to think about the lasting impact of the Dutroux case, not just on the victims and their families, but on all of Belgian society. This case left a permanent mark on the nation, a scar that continues to shape its identity and how it deals with justice, accountability, and child protection.
The Dutroux affair was a turning point in Belgian history. It was a national trauma that revealed deep flaws in society and led to a wave of reforms. It forced the nation to confront its weaknesses, acknowledge its shortcomings, and start on a path of healing and renewal.
The case completely changed how Belgium dealt with child sexual abuse and exploitation. It led to new laws, stronger institutions, and a greater awareness of the need to be more vigilant and proactive in protecting children.
The Dutroux case also had a deep impact on the Belgian psyche. It left a lasting feeling of vulnerability and a heightened awareness of the potential for evil hiding in plain sight. It shattered the illusion of innocence, the belief that these kinds of horrors could only happen somewhere else, to someone else.
And that awareness, that increased vigilance, is probably the most lasting legacy of the Dutroux case. It reminds us that we all need to be alert, that we can never be complacent, and that we must always be ready to speak out against injustice and fight to protect the most vulnerable among us.
The Dutroux case shows us that evil can be hiding anywhere, that it can look normal, and that it can thrive when people are silent and indifferent. It's a call to action for all of us to be aware, to be informed, and to actively work to create a world where children are safe from harm.
And that call to action goes beyond Belgium. What we learned from the Dutroux case applies to every society. It reminds us that the fight for justice, for accountability, and for protecting children is a global issue, a shared responsibility that needs constant vigilance and commitment.
The Dutroux story is one that we need to keep telling, one that we need to remember, and one that should inspire us to never give up on the fight for a world where children are safe, loved, and protected.
As we've been going through all this, I keep thinking about that dungeon, that carefully built place of horror. It wasn't just some random basement or hidden room. It felt like a symbol of Dutroux's messed up mind, showing his need for total control and how little he cared about human life.
Yeah, that dungeon wasn't something he just threw together. It was planned out, built in stages, and changed over time. It's really disturbing how much he thought about it beforehand. It wasn't just a place to keep victims, it was designed to dehumanize them and control them. The soundproofing, the secret entrance, how small and dirty it was, everything was meant to break their spirits and make them lose their identities.
And the fact that he recorded everything, that he filmed the abuse, makes it even worse, don't you think?
Like, he didn't just want to control them, he wanted to relive their suffering, to enjoy it over and over.
Definitely. Those recordings are really disturbing, not just because of what's on them, but because of what they tell us about Dutroux. He wasn't just committing these awful acts, he was making a record of them, almost like he wanted to leave behind a legacy of his power and control. That level of narcissism and sadism is hard to wrap your head around.
And he didn't do it alone. He wasn't some lone wolf. He created this whole network of accomplices, people who were either too scared or too twisted to stand up to him. Michelle Martin's role is especially baffling. I mean, she was his wife, the mother of his children. She could have stopped it, could have protected those girls. But she didn't say anything. She went along with him, even took part in the abuse. It's hard to understand why she did it, but it's a chilling example of how complicated human behavior can be and how powerful manipulation can be.
It really shows how evil can take over when good people stay silent. And in this case, the inaction, the missed chances went way beyond just Dutroux's close circle. The police messed up the investigations, ignored warnings, and there were so many systemic failures that allowed him to keep doing this for so long. All of that played a part in this tragedy.
The Dutroux case exposed some serious problems in the Belgian justice system. There was complacency, a lack of coordination, and it all allowed a predator to slip through the cracks again and again. It's no wonder the public was furious. They had every right to be angry, to demand that someone be held responsible, to question the whole system that had so clearly failed them.
And to their credit, they didn't just get angry, they demanded change. The parliamentary inquiries, all the media attention, the public protests, it all forced the justice system to change, to deal with the mistakes of the past and commit to a safer future.
The Dutroux case became the reason for real reform. It led to big changes in laws protecting children, how the police operate, and more oversight of the judicial process. It started a national conversation about how vulnerable children are, how important early intervention is, and how we need a more coordinated and proactive way to prevent abuse.
It shows that even after something truly terrible happens, positive change is still possible. The Dutroux case is a dark part of Belgian history, but it also shows how resilient people can be, how they can demand justice, and how they can work towards a better future.
And even though those reforms can't take away the pain and suffering Dutroux caused, they're a step in the right direction. They honor the memory of the victims, acknowledge the system's failures, and show a commitment to creating a society that truly protects children.
We spent a lot of time in the darkest parts of this case, but we can't forget that the story of Marc Dutroux isn't just about the monster. It's about the victims, their families, their incredible strength, and their fight for justice. It's about the investigators who never gave up on the truth, the journalists who bravely exposed what went wrong, and the everyday people who marched in the streets demanding change.
It's a story that shows us how fragile but also how resilient human society can be. It shows our capacity for great evil, but also our unwavering pursuit of justice and healing. The Dutroux case reminds us that we can never be complacent, that we always have to be vigilant, and that we need to work together to create a world where this never happens again.
We've come to the end of our deep dive, but the conversation about protecting children and holding abusers accountable has to continue. The Dutroux case is a serious warning, reminding us that evil can be anywhere, but it's also a call to action, a challenge for each of us to be more aware, more informed, and more involved in creating a world where all children can live without fear.
The Dutroux case is one of those stories that stays with you. It makes you think about the darkest parts of human nature and how we as individuals and as a society can try to prevent these kinds of atrocities from happening again. It reminds us that the pursuit of justice never ends. It's a commitment that requires constant vigilance and dedication.
Thank you for joining us on this tough but really important journey. We hope this deep dive has helped you understand this complex and tragic case and that it started a conversation that goes beyond just this episode.